I'm Francis Levy, co-director of the Philoctetes Center, and welcome to the final episode of Our Life in 6 Lyrical Poems, which was scheduled to coincide with the final episode of The Sopranos. That's said for the benefit of Tara Moran, who is a great friend of ours and a great fan of the Sopranos. In any case, we wanted to remind everyone, please silence your cell phones. And afterwards, I always forget this, but I'm not forgetting it now. We have books for sale, and Eamon might even autograph one.
Easy. Yeah, right. Absolutely.
I wanted to particularly, Mike Braziller here has had a especially heroic year this year in which he's prevailed and has gone on to create an amazing poetry program here at the Philoctetes Center, which, by the way, will...
Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you.
We're very proud of Mike, and we're very proud to be part of the program.
Great.
And also, I have to say that Mike Braziller is president of Persea Books, a publisher of literary fiction and poetry. And now I'm very happy to introduce Mike, who will in turn introduce our distinguished guest, who's returning to the final session of the Philoctetes Our Life in 6 Lyrical Poems. He also presided and was a guest at the first session on Thomas' Poems of Hardy. Take it away.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a perfect symmetry. You're beginning with Hardy, and now we actually, when I envisioned this whole program, I was thinking Hardy Yeats, you know. So
Right.
Next year we will be sending out emails over the summer. We're this time in a more organized way planning an ambitious schedule for next year. I don't want to forget Eamon. I will introduce Eamon now, and he will read I believe 2 of his own poems at the end of the evening, and I'm definitely looking forward to that. Eamon Grennan is from Dublin. He was educated at the University College in Dublin and Harvard, where he received his PhD. He has taught for many years at Vassar College, where he is the recently retired Dexter M. Ferry Jr. Professor of English. He's published 7 volumes of his own poetry, both in Ireland and the US. His Leopardi selected won the PEN Award for Poetry in Translation in 1997. He has published numerous essays and reviews. His poems appear regularly in magazines on both sides of the Atlantic, including Poetry, Poetry London, The New Yorker, The Nation, The New Republic, and many others. He's received awards in NEA and National Endowment for the Humanities and Guggenheim Foundation. Still Life with Waterfall received the Lenore Marshall Poetry Prize in 2003, and his most recent collection of poems is The Quick of It. He recently published his translation with his partner Rachel Kitzinger of Oedipus at Colonus. He lives in Poughkeepsie and the west of Ireland. Okay, William Butler Yeats.
Okay, we're on to Yeats, yeah. They're waving. People are waving. Okay. Yeah, if you want to come in now,
Veronica.
our forever stand.
Veronica.
Yeah. Okay. Are there seats? Everybody got seats? I mean, you okay? Yeah. Okay. So this is going to be wild because trying to pack Yeats into an hour and a half is, of course, Yeats is like trying to pick up that stuff with a fork. It's impossible to contain. The tiny piece of life I might offer just as a sort of brief introduction. Most of you know, I mean, you probably know the trajectory of Yeats's life and works and the extraordinary richness and vitality and variety which it represents, both on the Irish stage first, of course, and then the larger European stage, and then the world stage. And given Yeats and his occult engagements, the other world stage, which he is no stranger to at all, as you probably know from reading things like A Vision and many of the poems themselves. Born 1865, became a poet, became passionate about his poetry very, very early. Sligo, his landscapes are Sligo in the west of Ireland, London and Dublin. His father was a painter, J.B. Yeats, John Butler Yeats. His brother was a painter, Jack B. Yeats. He learned an awful lot from his father's impassioned aesthetics and his resistance to forms of tired Victorianism. Yeats himself began as a pre-Raphaelite in some ways. You know, a lot of those poems are being written in the 80s. His first book is in the 80s, and his last book is in the late 30s. So he spans a good 50 years of active, productive life with his work. And it moves, and we'll talk a little bit about this incidentally as we go, I'm sure, because that's part of the point. When you ever get to Yeats, you talk about changes, and you talk about a poet engaged to the degree he is with, as he says himself, remaking himself constantly, never standing still. For me, certainly, Yeats is a kind of model of the poetic career, as he is for lots of other people. Not that you want to imitate him. His voice is entirely his own, and if you did try, you'd fall on your face, among other things. He's not to be imitated, but he is to be admired, and up close and from far off. As well as his landscapes, there were his loves. Okay, so there's landscapes, there's loves. The Maud Gonne, of course, the amazing commitment of a lifetime passion, beginning in 1889 and ending in 1939, one presumes, in some ways. He also loved, incidentally, as we will hear in one of the poems, Maud Gonne's daughter, whom he also asked him to marry him. And another great love of his was early Olivia Shakespeare, who became the mother of Dorothy Shakespeare, who married Pound. And then, of course, Yeats lived with Pound for a while, and the whole interaction of Pound and Yeats is a fascinating topic in itself. One could go on about it. Aside from the poetry and all the books, I'll just name the books, and then I'll end this little introduction. 1889, Crossways, The Rose. In 1893, The Wind Among the Reeds was a kind of major step forward beyond the, what would one call it, the kind of high aestheticism, rather 90s aestheticism of The Rose and the Wind and the Crossways. Wind Among the Reeds is a book of love poems, kind of like a Petrarchan book. It's amazing, 1899, and it's a 90s book too, but it's the end of something, clearly. He has a couple of what would you call them, transitional books then, 1904 and 1910, full of dejected love poetry, among other things. In 1903, Maud Gonne got married, and not to Yeats, but to a man called John McBride, whom Yeats politely called a drunken, vainglorious lout, and in verse. And then McBride had the good manners to be shot in 1916 as one of the leaders of the revolution, and Yeats had to alter himself a little bit and sing him into the story as well. Which, you know, Yeats's capacity for change is one of the things we may talk about, I think. Change of attitude, change of understanding, change of vision, and of course change of form, change of language, really. The great transition book, or the great breakthrough book, is probably in 1914, and remember what happened in 1914, so it's just a pre-war book, or it's about a wartime book. Not a war, just as the war starts. It's called Responsibilities. And you can hear from a poem, our titles like The Wind Among the Reeds, or The Rose, and then Responsibilities, that you're going to be dealing with a very different poet. We're going to be dealing with a very different language. We're not going to do all that. We'll see a little bit of that. Wild Swans at Cool takes 1919, and then the great other, probably the pinnacle, the summit, the battlements of Yeats's work is The Tower, of which we'll do the central poem, the title poem, which appeared in 1928. The next book is also connected with The Tower, which Yeats bought. We'll go on about that in 1920s. No, in 1917 he bought The Tower, but the next book is called The Winding Stair and Other Poems, and that was the stair inside the tower, and I might have something to say about that too later. And then the wild old wicked man becomes in full force in the later poems, writing poems of extraordinary radical passion and indifference and anger, in poems like, in books like Words for Music, perhaps, or Full Moon in March, and then finally Last Poems, which he lived to, the poems to finish, but not to see the final organisation, because it comes out in 39. I think that's the other things that he was involved in, obviously, were theatre. I mean, he started the great theatre. And Yeats is at the heart of what's called the Irish Revival, the Irish Renaissance, the Irish Literary Renaissance, or Irish Literary Revival. And in some ways, he is it. And in some ways, it is a movement that takes place parallel to the great movement in Ireland at the time for national identity. So here is this cultural force establishing cultural identity while political identity is trying to be established, and is finally established in 1922 when Yeats becomes, after the treaty, after the Civil War, he becomes a senator. Around the time of the Civil War, he becomes a senator. So he is, he straddles worlds, theatre, poetry, the occult. The book called The Vision, we won't go into very much, but it's fascinating. He says metaphors for his poems, and it's connected with his wife's habit of automatic writing. And he is in the political realm, but above all, he's a lyric poet. Yeah. I think what we love about Yeats, what we find enduring about Yeats, aside from the playwright, aside from the political force, aside from the cultural energy, aside from the occult magician, the couple of great volumes of biography by John Foster, not John Foster, what's his first name? Roy Foster. Two books, one called Apprenticeship, The Apprentice Mage, and one called The Arch Poet, and you can hear in those two the kind of feel of Yeats as a supremely hieratic figure. And I think the poems, for me, however, isn't so much the hieratic as the fact that this is a poet whose poetry kept pace with his life at every inch of the journey. And for the few poems we're doing will show tiny elements of that. But it is, for me, the model is that he kept pace, that here is poetry, language, keeping pace with experience, mapping the world of fact and of feeling with language that is adequate to it in some way. So that's a kind of interesting.
And of course, as he changed, he also remained the same. And I mentioned
he grew like a tree,
right.
Round and round. Yeah.
We'll get into the poems now, but I mentioned on the way over that we selected these. Really, the major poem is The Tower. It's the great poem. It's about the psychological crisis of old age. It's just an absolute masterpiece. And beyond that, we selected a few favorites that we both liked or we thought were really great lyrical, shorter poems. But I mentioned on the way over that just as I was looking at all these poems together, I noticed the very first poem is called, and the first four words are "When You Were Old," and the last poem ends, "Would that I were young again," and then The Tower is about aging. So this was from the very first early volume. This concern with age and. Right. And it's really,
I guess we might say those of you who have come to these before know the format. We'll talk poem. I mean, we'll read and talk a poem. At the end of each, Michael and I have said we might take a question at the end of each poem, but prefer it to, if you have a question that's utterly urgent and needs to break windows or to counteract some terrible heresy, that'd be grand. But it'd be nice to, and we will leave time at the end.
Or at least
it means cutting things off. That's all. We're not going to be exhaustive.
Because we want to share these poems, but the real poem is The Tower. That's what we're trying to get to. And after that, we'll ease up and then. Okay. So how about if I read When You Were Old?
Yeah.
Okay.
Read away.
Okay. This is a very early one from The Rose. When you were old and gray and full of sleep and nodding by the fire. Take down this book and slowly read and dream of the soft look your eyes had once and of their shadows deep. How many loved your moments of glad grace and loved your beauty with love false or true. But one man loved the pilgrim soul in you and loved the sorrows of your changing face. And bending down beside the glowing bars, murmur a little sadly how love fled and paced upon the mountains overhead. And hid his face amid a crowd of stars.
That's great. It's lovely. 1891, very early, but Yeats had already fallen in love with Maud Gonne in 1889, and it's a gorgeous love poem. What we know about it is it's also a kind of very free translation of Ronsard, which I've given you on that little sheet with the tower picture on it. Two of you have it. But it's a Ronsard sonnet. Quand vous serez bien vieux, soir la chandelle. It's a lovely poem. I'm not going to try abusing it in my French, but it's a very different poem, and it's very interesting to see what Yeats does as a translator. He just takes control. He's one of those translators, like a great pirate, who just simply claims the poem for his own. For Ronsard, the sonnet is the sort of carpe diem sonnet, because he says in the sonnet, if you know, since you're going to be old, and since you're going to look at my book and so forth, well then, why don't we do it today? Basically, it's a sort of Andrew Marvell, you know, or gather ye rosebuds. And in fact, he says at the time, come pluck now today, life's so quickly fading rose. So it's one kind of poem for Ronsard. It's a poem by a young man trying to persuade the woman. It's a very conventional thing. It's all over the Renaissance, isn't it? Trying to persuade to pluck life's rose. Yeats is full of a kind of 90s moody, it's almost as if it's an old man talking. He gets rid of, he doesn't dare say to let's pluck the rose today to Maud Gonne. I don't know why, maybe she was taller than he was, but she was an extravagant woman, but he didn't take that. It's a very mannerly thing. It's a different kind. It's not carpe diem. Yeats is a kind of mood maker for its own sake. This is what this poem is clearly doing. The things that I love about it are actually, there's a kind of fluent lyrical ease. Even then, Yeats is, I mean, he's not that young, mind you. You know, in 1900, in 1890, he's 26 years old. Yeah. So it's an early poem, but you can already see what a great ear he has. How lovely those, and you can hear too in that poem the extraordinary sense. It's a single sentence, but it's a sentence orchestrated and metrically by those iambics, line by line by line by line. He worked according to line. Yeats hardly punctuated, by the way, himself. A lot of editors had to punctuate for Yeats, because there's a lovely story about Yeats and punctuation, which is he's giving dictation, and after 25 minutes he raises his head and he says, comma, you know. It's a Yeats story. There's lots of those. But Maud Gonne, of course, is the subject of the poem, one presumes, but it's full of the gestures of age already. It's an interesting poem. Yeats is so obsessed as a young man by aging, and there are a whole heap of poems in the early books about aging. There's a poem called Ephemera. Do you remember that poem?
No.
Well,
how does it go?
Well, you know, I won't bother it, but it is, that's a terrible thing to ask me. Because I just, you know.
I know it well. I know it well.
But it's full of gestures of aging. You wanted to say to Michael here to this one.
Yeah, and also it seems a premonition of what we're going to be reading later, that he that this sense of sort of unfairness. You know, he loved her with more complexity and more truth, and with a greater intimate knowledge of her than all the others. But he lost her anyways. And this is very, I mean, in every way a Yeatsian idea.
Yeah, because absolutely. It's the desired, the endlessness of desire. I mean, Yeats makes his living on the endlessness of desire, fundamentally, particularly in the early poems.
We're going to talk about a dialogue of self and soul, but on the way up I was looking at one of the favorite lines in there. A living man is blind and drinks his drop. That's how part 2 begins of a dialogue of self and soul. And there's this idea that it all doesn't make sense, it isn't fair, we can't see the whole picture, and yet the potential for joy is enormous in the middle of all of that too.
I think that's right. I think the crux in Yeats is how to celebrate what's awful, you know, basically, which is, I think, the business of lyric poetry is fundamentally how to sing in spite of I mean, I think that's what great lyric poetry is probably always attempting, and I think Yeats is one of the great exemplars of that. It's also man is in love and loves what vanishes. Is a saying from another poem.
And the unfairness of love. And one other thing, and I raised this as a question at the ending. He says, "Where love fled and paced upon the mountains overhead." Does this remind you of different notes he touches upon, Wild Swans of Cool and elsewhere? This idea where this deep passion, this tremendous life force, or in memory,
yes,
it can move on.
Yeah.
It can be turned over to others.
I think that's absolutely true.
Is he touching
I
this
think
here?
he touches that, and I think he also touches the fact that he can finalize something, if that's not the bad word there, in an image. Oh. That great last image of the end, those 2.5 lines, pure syntactical gorgeousness about love, straight out of Dante, I suspect.
Well,
Yeats loved Dante, and in the Vita Nuova, you have love eaten the heart of the poet. You know, and it's Dante. I mean, I'm sure Yeats loved the Vita Nuova.
He speaks in the Wild Swans of Cool, and particularly in the short poem Memory.
Yes.
He tells us what the poem is through an image. He tells us his deepest theme through a picture.
And in that sense, Yeats is a kind of architectural imagist, because he mixes architecture and image so beautifully.
And as you point out, the music here too.
What I love, there's a very early sketch that Yeats did when he was a kid. It was 9 years old or 10 years old. I just came across it there in the biography. And it's of a church and a little cottage, but it's fantastically, and there's pictures by his brother and his 2 sisters as well, and they're all over the place. But Yeats is fantastically organized. And what I love in some ways is the architectural power within which he has a great deal of fluent, and I think fluent movement. And I think in many ways Yeats is, at the heart of Yeats, stylistically or technically, is a mastery of syntax. His muscularity of syntax in Yeats. He said himself that he has only tried to revise towards a more impassioned syntax. Always. He's always looking. And syntax is that which contains, you know, I mean, it's that which an enormous amount of stuff is being held. And Yeats's syntax, which he learned from people like John Donne and so on, is remarkable. And you can see in this poem, even that early, how syntactically it's elegant. Metrically, it's much simpler than poems we're going to see. And the whole thing is going to be rather simpler. But there's the other thing that we'd say, and then we'll move on to the next poem because we can't exhaust it, that it's a voice almost impersonal. You know? It doesn't give biographical data. It gives feeling. And so he manages to, from very early on, and it becomes more extravagant and more elaborate and more powerful later, but he manages to find a way to deliver private emotion in a public voice. He was pleased by somebody in America, actually, some critic saying that his was a public manner. And indeed, public manner. There's a kind of ability for Yeats as not a rhetorician but as an orator. There's a curious mix of the private dilemma being given oratorical, operatic almost embody in some ways. I think we'll see that in other ones.
Okay, now this was a very early one, remarkable for when he wrote a very famous poem, a poem many people memorize and never forget. But now suddenly we will jump ahead to some real masterpieces. And would you like to read The Wild Swans?
The Wild Swans, read The Wild Swans. Okay. This is I won't say anything about it until I've finished it. But I will say a little bit about it, insofar as it's cool is where his great patron, and friend Lady Gregory, had her big house. She was, and this is something to remember, Anglo-Irish, and Yeats came from the Anglo-Irish. So in Ireland there's the native Irish and the Anglo-Irish, and the attempted reconciliation of the two in the new state. Cool was the place Yeats went as his haven and his retreat. The Wild Swans, there was a lake it's an odd lake because it disappears and then it comes back. It's called a turlock. They're all over the west of Ireland because it's a certain kind of landscape, which may account for the fact that in the early draft of the poem, the lake is dry, but in the later draft it's brimming. It's a curious fact as Yeats changes and he sees it in two different ways. So the other thing to remember, he's written it in 1917, not long after he proposed for the 100th time to Maud Gonne, and then not long after that proposed to her daughter. And both of them said no. I mean, she said no, and then the daughter said Iseult Gonne, and whom he was passionate about for many years and who led him on to a certain degree, but not to the point of marriage. And then, yeah, go.
No, it's a very important point. I was, you're going to mention, or I was going to mention it afterwards. The poem does not say directly what it's about. It's, and to know this little biographical piece helps appreciate the poem, even though it's complete. We'll see that it's completely within the poem. Okay, but it will make it quicker.
Yeah, I think that's important too, because certain kind of lyricism uses a subject or an image charged with feeling that isn't part of the literal element in the poem, and so that you get this feeling for something. You say, why is that feeling there? Anyway, the wild swans at Cool. The trees are in their autumn beauty, the woodland paths are dry. Under the October twilight, the water mirrors a still sky. Upon the brimming water among the stones are 59 swans. The 19th autumn has come upon me since I first made my count. I saw, before I'd well finished, all suddenly mount and scatter, wheeling in great broken rings upon their clamorous wings. I've looked upon those brilliant creatures, and now my heart is sore. All's changed since I, hearing at twilight the first time on this shore, the bell beat of their wings above my head, trod with a lighter tread. Unwearied still, lover by lover, they paddle in the cold, companionable streams or climb the air. Their hearts have not grown old. Passion or conquest, wander where they will, attend upon them still. But now they drift on the still water, mysterious, beautiful. Among what rushes will they build? By what lake's edge or pool delight men's eyes when I awake some day to find they have flown away? To me, well, we'll talk, Michael will say things about it too, but it's impeccable poem. Metrically, acoustically, it's one of the most gorgeous acoustic performances of such patent simplicity and pellucid qualities. It's beyond criticism in many ways, but we'll have a go anyway. We talk about it anyway.
Is it a ballad-like?
I think he made up this stanza. Actually, one of the first things to notice is the stanza. Right. It's 5/3. I mean, 5 beat, 3 beat, 5 beat, 3 beat, 5 beat, 3 beat. But that's not a ballad stanza, which is 4 and 2, I guess. Right. Or whatever the ballad stanza is. It's his own. The interesting thing for me,
and this long fifth line,
and the fifth line is longer. Although upon the brimming water, among the still only it's a pentameter line, are 59 swans. It's a pentameter and a trimeter line, I suppose. 5 beats, 3 beats, roughly. Because the lovely thing is the fluency with which he moves, and you hear it as meter, but it ain't. Meter. It's not a meter you can actually fix. It's fundamentally a kind of iambic, but it's not fixable. It's gorgeous to me. To hear a poem like this is to hear the way speech and song are actually porous to one another, because it becomes so metrically, lyrically fluent. And at the same time, it is somebody talking. The trees are in their autumn beauty. It's simple, straightforward, it's idiomatic. And yet it's beautiful in its fluency and in its lyrical kind of containment. The other thing that I noticed, by the way, Michael, I don't know if you noticed when you were doing it, it's a 6-line poem, but there's a missing rhyme each stanza.
Yeah.
There's only 2. It's A, B, C, B. D, D. A, B, C, B. Whoa.
No, I have.
Isn't it beauty, dry and sky, beauty and water, a me finished, creatures twilight, soar shore. You see?
Right.
It's A, B, C, B. So there's one you expect it's a he used the 6-line stanza often, but usually he'd be A, B, A, B, C, C, or something like that, right? But this is curious, and everything about this poem is about odd man out. And then you think of the emotional stuff. I mean, Swan's mate for life. If there are 59, I'll use use your arithmetic. So that's one thing to think about. But also, I looked at some of the drafts of the poem, and it is quite amazing because he had the poems. The swans were 5 and 40 dream creatures one time. 5 and 42 he had another time. He got married, and another time was 59, and then it was 9 and 50. And there's something wonderfully plangent about 9 and 50. But so one other thing quite amusing to say about it was Yeats he's not a great describer. He's a great evoker. But there's a very amusing story about Stephen Spencer going to the Cool, knocking on the door and asking for Lady Gregory. And the servant says, "Oh, she's down by the lake counting the swans for Willie." The amount of stuff that. So he got 59. My point is that, as Yeats himself would say, out of such things, this great lyric is evolved. Is generated. I'm sure there are other things to say, Michael.
No, I just point out how the poem begins with this beautiful description and gradually grows. By stanza 2, begins to get slightly more personal.
Yes.
And then by stanza...
It sets the landscape, and then it's the self, right?
Yeah. But it not only gets descriptive or personal, but it gets very personal. He turns almost... It's a kind of mournful nostalgia for his early years, but then something else. He throws out something else. His heart is sore, and all's changed.
Yeah.
Now, what is that about? Does he? And I ask that as a question. Does he? What in the last 19 years? What is he talking? What all's changed?
I would say
my heart is sore. He doesn't say what it is.
Right. Right. One presumes it has to do with his passions, his love. He was a young man in 1898. He wasn't all that young. He was over 30, but he was. That 1898 is 19 years back. Is that correct?
Yeah.
You're right. So in the 90s, he's thinking of himself as a young poet. He is in 1917. He is 50, 52. But I mean, it is age.
Isn't that what's changed? Is this sort of optimism or hopefulness about a certain condition that he might have had as a young man?
That's right.
He doesn't feel now.
That's right.
But isn't the secret to it in the next stanza?
That
does he begin to? Is there sort of an envy of the swans? Is he beginning to compare certain qualities in his description of them
No question.
to his own?
No question. Yeah, he sees this image in the natural world. And I would say one of the poems that stands behind it, I think there's Wordsworth, there's a bit of Shelley. There's a famous picture of a swan in Shelley's poem called Alastor, which I won't bother you with, but it's there, as they say. Anyway, it's a very famous description of the swan, and I think he takes it from there as he takes it in the tower. There's another swan in the tower. Remember, swan in the tower.
Oh, that just swims out upon the bridge. Yes,
exactly.
We have to focus. So that's great. The way,
the image of the swan for Yeats. And in this case, the unwearied still is that sense that the love of... But the other poem, I should say, that stands behind this is surely Keats's Nightingale, in which the bird becomes the eternal recurrence of possibility, whereas the natural man, the ordinary guy, the human person exists in a linear way in which all gets changed. Remember that great third stanza in the Keats poem is... what is it? The weariness, the fever, and the fret. Here, where men sit and hear each other groan. That the bird is free of all that, and these birds are also free of the feel of the poet, that he has changed in time and time has changed him, and they are unwearied still. I love that word still in this
Unwearied.
It occurs a number of times. Still water and still as a temporal thing. And it's kind of like the birds are frozen in time, or they're outside time on this stilled water, and they can still be lovers, for example, is what he says.
I think,
here.
the key thing is lover by lover.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
that is a comparison to his own grief and disappointment. I think, as you pointed out originally, that
absolutely.
And it's done all through tone and the musicality and his great syntax and all the things you're talking about. It can almost easily be missed, and yet it's central. It's central to the poem.
It seems so simple to start with, and yet it's a poem of profound feeling. When you look at it, it talks about the past, the present, the past, and the future.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to see what he does in drafts, because in one of the in the poem that was published in the magazine first, in Poetry or somewhere, actually, it was published over here. It was, let's see, what is now the last stanza used to be the third stanza. Okay, and the last stanza was unwearied still, lover by lover, and the third stanza ended with that slightly melancholy feel of the swans as full of passion and conquest, and forever young, you might say.
That may, because in a way the final stanza is a little bit more kind of conventional, or a little less interesting than the lover by lover stanza.
I agree, except for the fact that it points to the future, and it opens the poem at the end rather than closing it off, which the other ending would be. That's why drafts are interesting to look at, right? To see what are the choices. It's the time you can get behind the poet and say, what choices are being made and why? It's one of the few times you can actually say, poet's intention is such and such, and he changed that in order to end on this peculiar note of which is, will they build when I'm not around to see them anymore? But it is projecting into the future. And in that sense, the poem opens up instead of closes down at the end, which I find in a five stanza poem to treat of past, present, and future so simply and so compressed. I think it's the condensation in Yeats that I love, among other things. That sense of lyrical compression,
And again, tonally, that last stanza reminds me even of the previous poem, how love fled and paced upon the mountains. Rather than the feeling of flight, of this tremendous dynamic, this passionate dynamic, we have it only so long.
That's right.
And then the Tower will discuss how he deals with that problem.
No question.
When the body hangs around.
Oh, yeah.
And
to mention the Nightingale, at the end of the Nightingale, remember, fled is that music? Do I wake or sleep? Bang, bird is gone over the hills, through the valleys, into the next glade, and so on. It's a bit like Yeats devoured, digested, and made his influences invisible. He digests them so well. But Keats, the Romantics, and Wordsworth and Shelley are all over Yeats when you start to pick at it in some ways. But they've been digested to such a degree that you'd hardly know they were there. And he wouldn't want you to know they were there. I think, in some ways, Maybe we do memory, will we?
Memory, This is this is one of the greatest short poems. At least in my opinion, it's incredible. Memory. I'll just throw out two now so that I don't forget that in the Tower, one of the central questions he asks himself is, does the imagination dwell the most upon a woman won or a woman lost? It's one of the great questions. I throw that out because here we have similar tonalities and a different view of a kind of a similar profound emotional feeling. Anyways, One had a lovely face, and 2 or 3 had charm, but charm and face were in vain, because the mountain grass cannot but keep the form where the mountain hare has lain. Now, immediately I'd say, we saw with Wild Swans at Cool, where through images and through his great, all of his, his genius that we're talking about, he states the most powerful issue and really the most deeply intimate issue in the poem, and he does it again here magnificently. One had a lovely face, 2 or 3 had charm, sounds almost like a cavalier or a calloused sort of lover or womanizer or somebody. The implication is that he had more than 1 or 2. One had a lovely face and 2 or 3 had charm. But then the poem begins to change dramatically towards this final image. But charm and face were in vain, because the mountain grass cannot but keep the form where the mountain hare has lain. Now, obviously what he's saying, I hope, if you're reading the poem for the first time, you're beginning, I don't know, I've read this over the years many times, I don't know how obvious it is. But it's one of the most brilliant descriptions of the impact a strong personality or person that one can make upon another. And that nothing, so from this cavalier kind of beginning, it turns to the most, the most deeply loving, or put it, it's about the enormous impact and impression, almost sensuous or sexual, of a hare making a nest. It's felt so physically. But it's about the impression, the unforgettable impression, presumably a woman had upon him, and that nothing will ever compare, and that certainly is biographical.
Oh yeah, one presumes. And again, it's kind of like Michael says, it's the ability to generalize his particular experience, and yet in some not be autobiographical in some factual way, because he explodes it into an image, and the image is all of our image. We all possess the image, and his experience has been distilled and then released into the image. It's the way his manner can be both intimate and at the same time have the sort of dignity of the impersonal. Patrick Kavanagh, Irish poet after Yeats, said that poetry is the only place a man can confess with dignity. And I think Yeats, he might have been thinking about in that to some degree.
Well, you could call it universality, too.
Exactly.
It's the emotional power to deal with our most personal experiences.
Yeah.
And even, I would use the psychological developmental experiences and the crisis of development. It's unparalleled to me. His humanism, you know what I was saying? He's like a friend of the reader. He's like, whatever doubts, he reaches out in a way that, and maybe it's close to what you're saying, is that it's not confessional or personal. It's he's talking of a large feeling he may be having. Yeah. But he's telling us it's all right. Not that it's all right, but that it's. But
he does it in such.
Makes us a friend in a way.
Yeah, I think that's true. He's not. He allows for. He's entirely solipsistic in certain ways. Yeats. He's entirely self-possessed and self-referential, but not self-regarding, and he is able to generate images that are. Shared, that like you're saying, he shares them with us. There is that ability to generalize and not be autobiographical. It's poetry of emotional revelation, but it's not confessional. Compare it to Plath, compare it to Lowell. You're working in a different, or Berryman, you're working in a different zone I presume, of utterance, all of whom are influenced by Yeats, one might add. But you're working in recognizable biographical matter, particularly with Lowe, let's say, life studies or something. And in a way with Yeats, he has digested it into, and then he gives it back as image in some way. His imagination is the mountain grass. I love the way he uses the word form there, which actually is the technical word for the nest of a hare. But of course, it's so many other things too. I mean, Yeats isn't one for puns much of the time, except maybe in one of the poems in the Tower too, but because pun might be seen as cheap. But in this case, he is actually using a pun because the mountain grass cannot but keep the form where the mountain hare has lain. It's the hare was terribly important. The Irish hare, by the way, is a unique creature. It's a leftover of the Ice Age. It was there. It's different from the other hares. All right, so I insist on the Irish hare's uniqueness. But for Yeats, it is also a mythic. It is also a mythic creature. It's big in Celtic mythology, and the hare was a goddess, and a woman shape changer became a hare. Very often in there's a question. Yeah, is it a question? No, you just point. I think there's a tiny kind of specific density here that's wonderful. Who is he talking about? Is it he referred to Isolde as a hare, the daughter, but I don't think one had a lovely face. He was in love with Olivia Shakespeare, who has a gorgeous face, like a Renaissance medallion, he says. I don't know who the 2 or 3 with charm had. God knows, could be 200 or 300. Charm and face were in vain. I mean, it's again Yeats's ability to generalise and to be what I would call courtly in the exposure of his own vulnerability. You know, and because it's about vulnerability, it's about being impressed. It's about
I mean, in a certain way, this could be treated as a tragic episode.
Oh yeah, yeah,
I mean,
right.
This was devastating to him, and he makes it, and he
stamps it. You know,
he stamps it and shares it.
That's right.
And shares it without solipsism.
That's right.
You know,
because this poem was also written around 1917. When the Wild Swans and all that emotional stuff has taken place. Incidentally, that's also when he got married. Neither to Maud Gonne nor her daughter, but to George Hyde Lees. And is she the hare? I don't know. She probably not, because in another poem he has her as a speckled cat and Isolde Gonne as a hare. The wild. I think the word wild is terribly important too. Isn't it in here? No, it's not in here. Sorry, it was in the Wild Swans. But the wild hare, the hare as a sort of untrammeled creature.
And it's also just this sense of a living man is blind and drinks his drop. This sense of we're animals. We don't you know.
Creatures.
We're creatures, and. You know, when she's old and grey, and not, she might have made a mistake, but she followed her creature, and we, and here it is, and
there's a kind of gestury quality about Yeats that's utterly fatal if you try to get it as a poet. One had a lovely face. Imagine someone saying that. Yeah. Imagine John Ashbery saying that.
Yeah.
You know, it's full. Yes, yourself.
The amazing thing about it is. What makes it so great is, what is that hare? What's he talking about? In every one of his poems, he's saying something that you really can't figure out. That's, it's so deep.
That's right.
It's symbolic. It's real. It's concrete. And yet, what is it?
What's the exact name? And that's what I was saying about about the charge of feeling.
Yes.
That you can feel and a certain kind of not ponderous, but the depth of the poem, like you say. All right, I suppose we should move on.
Yeah, and then paradoxically, he was so versatile, that in a poem like The Tower and Dialogue of Self and Soul, we begin to hear rhetoric, we begin to hear ideas, we begin to hear theories, and yet mixed in with all of
is the real stuff, just like this. Yeah. I mean, wait till we see the Tower. We'll see the Tower now, but the 3 points we've just done are kind of prologue, because in the Tower something very different is going to happen. One of the things that happens, well, maybe we'll read it
Let's
first.
just read it.
Yeah,
You were going to
and
do
then-
one, I'll do the long two, and you do the long three.
Okay. Good. So we'll start the tower.
Yeah.
And you've got the tower there. That was the cover of the book, the tower, just so as you know what he was talking about,
Yeah.
or where he was. And he's up on the battlements. And he bought it in 1916, and he bought it to be a kind of symbol of his work. Interesting enough, so that he could live in a symbol. That was Yeats all over. He wanted to. The whole landscape is a mass of symbols and images, and he was big enough to be able to manage that. Anyway, we'll read it and then we'll talk about it. It's in the west of Ireland. The Tower. 1. What shall I do with this absurdity? O heart, O troubled heart, this caricature, decrepit age that has been tied to me as to a dog's tail. Never had I more excited, passionate, fantastical imagination, or an ear and eye that more expected the impossible. No, not in boyhood, when with rod and fly or the humbler worm I climbed Ben Bulben's back and had the livelong summer day to spend. It seems that I must bid the muse go pack, choose Plato and Plotinus for a friend, until imagination, ear and eye can be content with argument and deal in abstract things, or be derided by a sort of battered kettle at the heel.
2. I pace upon the battlements and stare on the foundations of a house, or where a tree, like a sooty finger, starts from the earth, and send imagination forth under the day's declining beam, and call images and memories from rune or from ancient trees. For I would ask a question of them all. Beyond that ridge lived Mrs. French, and once, when every silver candlestick or sconce lit up the dark mahogany and the wine, a serving man that could divine the most respected lady's every wish, ran and with the garden shears clipped an insolent farmer's ears and brought them in a little covered dish. Some few remembered still when I was young a peasant girl commended by a song, who lived somewhere upon that rocky place and praised the color of her face and had the greater joy in praising her, remembering that if she walked there, farmers jostled at the fair, so great a glory did that song confer. And certain men, being maddened by those rhymes, or else by toasting her a score of times, rose from the table and declared it right to test their fancy by their sight. But they mistook the brightness of the moon for the prosaic light of day. Music had driven their wits astray, and one was drowned in the great bog of Clun. Strange, but the man who made that song was blind. Yet now I have considered it, I find that nothing strange. The tragedy began with Homer, that was a blind man, and Helen has all living hearts betrayed. Oh, may the moon and sunlight seem one inextricable beam, for if I triumph, I must make men mad. And I myself created Hanrahan and drove him drunk or sober through the dawn, from somewhere in the neighboring cottages. Caught by an old man's juggleries, he stumbled, tumbled, fumbled to and fro, and had but broken knees for hire, and horrible splendor of desire. I thought it out all 20 years ago. Good fellows shuffled cards in an old bawn, and when that ancient ruffian's turn was on, he so bewitched the cards under his thumb that all but the one card became a pack of hounds and not a pack of cards, and that he changed into a hare. Hanrahan rose in frenzy there and followed up those baying creatures towards I have forgotten what, enough. I must recall a man that neither love nor music nor an enemy's clipped ear could, he was so harried, cheer. A figure that has grown so fabulous, there's not a neighbor left to say, when he finished his dog's day, an ancient bankrupt master of the house. Before that rune came, for centuries rough men-at-arms, cross-gartered to the knees or shod in iron, climbed the narrow stairs, and certain men-at-arms they were, whose images in the great memory stored, come with loud cry and panting breast to break upon a sleeper's rest, while their great wooden dice beat on the board. As I would question all, come all who can, come old necessitous, half-mounted man, and bring beauty's blind rambling celebrant. The red man the juggler sent through God-forsaken meadows, Mrs. French, gifted with so fine an ear. The man drowned in a bog's mire when mocking muses chose the country wench. Did all old men and women, rich and poor, who trod upon these rocks or passed this door, whether in public or in secret rage, as I do now against old age. But I have found an answer in those eyes that are impatient to be gone. Go, therefore, but leave Hanrahan, for I need his mighty memories. Old Letcher, with a love on every wind, bring up out of that deep considering mind all that you have discovered in the grave, for it is certain that you have reckoned up every unforeknown, unseeing plunge, lured by a softening eye, or by a touch or a sigh, into the labyrinth of another's being. Does the imagination dwell the most upon a woman won or a woman lost? If on the lost admit you turned aside from a great labyrinth out of pride, cowardice, some silly over subtle thought, or anything called conscience once, and that if memory recur, the sun's under eclipse and the day blotted out.
3. It's time I wrote my will. I choose upstanding men that climb the streams until the fountain leap, and at dawn drop their cast at the side of dripping stone. I declare they shall inherit my pride, the pride of people that were bound neither to cause nor to state, neither to slaves that were spat on, nor to the tyrants that spat, the people of Burke and of Grattan that gave, though free to refuse. Pride like that of the morn when the headlong light is loose, or that of the fabulous horn, or that of the sudden shower when all streams are dry, or that of the hour when the swan must fix his eye upon a fading gleam, float out upon a long last reach of glittering stream, and there sing his last song. And I declare my faith, I mock Plotinus' thought, and cry in Plato's teeth, death and life were not till man made up the whole, made lock, stock and barrel out of his bitter soul, aye, sun and moon and star, all, and further add to that, that being dead we rise, dream, and so create translunar paradise. I've prepared my peace with learned Italian things, and the proud stones of Greece, poets' imaginings, and memories of love, memories of the words of women, all those things whereof man makes a superhuman mirror resembling dream. As at the loophole there, the daws chatter and scream, and drop twigs layer upon layer. When they have mounted up, the mother bird will rest on their hollow top, and so warm her wild nest. I leave both faith and pride to young upstanding men climbing the mountainside, that under bursting dawn they may drop a fly, being of that metal made till it was broken by this sedentary trade. Now shall I make my soul, compelling it to study in a learned school, till the wreck of body, slow decay of blood, testy delirium, or dull decrepitude, or what worse evil come, the death of friends, or death of every brilliant eye that made a catch in the breath, seem but the clouds of the sky when the horizon fades, or a bird's sleepy cry among the deepening shades. Right.
Yeah.
You want to say something first? Yeah. It's such a journey, isn't it, the poem? And one of the things we were talking about, and then we can you say it, just to say it, it's a poem unlike any of the poems we've read so far because of its parts, because of its fragmentariness, because of its randomness almost, the way he encloses randomness, and because of its meandering. The winding stair inside the tower seems to me a good image for what Yeats is at. The meander of the stair and the fixity of the tower are two images that are bound in a poem like this, you might say, formally, as the poem meanders. I love that moment where he says, towards I have forgotten what. Yeah. It's a perfect example that the poem is taking place.
He's just asked one of the longest questions in English literature, too. Actually, there are two questions.
That's right.
But but yes.
You know, it just goes on. But it's a lovely example, isn't it, of the poem is the process of making the poem. And making the poem brings him from being afraid that he'll have to deal with Plato and Plotinus to mocking Plato and Plotinus and finding a way to turn age into something, right?
Yeah. You could say it's a journey of sensibility where it begins with a certain problem and that he has to grow into or sail into a...
That's right. It's interesting you say sail because this poem in the collection called The Tower takes place after sailing to Byzantium, which is the poem in which he steps out of history. And it's the first 4 poems in The Tower are dated. And Yeats didn't do that before. It's very, very interesting. There's 1928, 1927, or 26, 1920, the next one is whatever the third one is, and then 1919. And they're in reverse order. So he's doing something very curious about art and history. I won't bother going into it. But the sailing to Byzantium has established the golden bird outside history, singing of what is past and passing and to come. And next thing, The Tower plunges him back into personal history, into aging, into process, into decay, into his own life, I suppose.
Well, why don't we go through it the best we can? Let's try to characterize, or I'll throw out a characterization of part 1.
Right.
As a passionate, spirited person in a humiliating predicament that he must contemplate putting away earlier forms of pleasure
and poetry. I mean, he's really thinking of putting away poetry, of lyricism, and instead of lyricism, he's going to get philosophy. A terrible exchange.
Pack the muse. You're absolutely right. He's thinking of, but he comes back to the muse again in the last section. What does he say? The sedentary trade.
That's right.
And So
you're absolutely right about that. And
so yes, he's contemplating because of age, giving up all the pleasures, and reading Plato.
That's right.
Okay. And Plotinus. Then
abstractors, he would say.
Okay.
Idealists, he would say. He's not right necessarily, right? I mean, but that's Yeats. He doesn't have to be right; it just has to be Yeats, the poet. Right.
Now, part 2 is an abrupt change in tone.
That's right. Before you leave part 1,
go ahead.
Don't leave the absurdity at the beginning, which is a heart, and the caricature, and it's an abstraction, decrepit age, tied to him like to a dog's tail, which comes out again with the battered kettle at the heel.
Right.
It's wonderful how what seems casual because of the speech of the poem, and it's again an extraordinary example because it's in A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B. So it's down through the line formally, but at the same time, it's just like speech. What'll I do with this absurdity? It's so idiomatically, colloquially, not really colloquially, but idiomatically forceful. And the way, again, he explodes an abstraction into an image. Age becomes a battered kettle at the heel. I mean... by the way, he's only 60.
But yes,
right?
I know, but
he felt things deeply. I believe he's only 60 when he's writing this poem. It's terrifying to think.
A lot older than.
That's what they say, right? I hope
he maintains this wonderful colloquial or kind of intimate tone through the more regular stanzas that come next, and he does. That's one of the great achievements of them. That he's talking person to person. And yet maintaining a regular rhyme and line length and so forth.
And you can see these 8-line stanzas. I think they're 8 lines, 3 and 5 or 8. And it's a sort of ottava rima, okay? So it's B, B, C, D, D, C. Okay, so it's two quatrains,
Now he begins in part 2 a kind of a nest building. Which actually we have the hare's nest, and then we have the daw's nest at the end.
Jackdaws, those are from, the jackdaw, right?
No, what are they?
Jackdaw's a kind of crow. It's a small
Yeah,
crow.
right.
In Ireland there are jackdaws and what's the other one? What's the other one? Well, ravens,
Rooks.
yes. Rooks, thanks. Thanks. It takes a poet. So but the nest building is dead on. That's what this poem is about, I suspect.
And identity building, which is an extension of that. But he from this immediate part one, this statement of a humiliating, what he considers to be an ultimate, a humiliating crisis. He begins a shift in tone in part two, and he begins, I guess, to sum it up or to bring close to him and to consciousness the things that he holds most dear,
right,
and perhaps give him the greatest sense of identity and strength,
right,
to deal with this crisis. And that's why we were talking before this movement.
Right.
I love the line. I just have to throw it. I tried to express that when I read it, but beyond that ridge lived Mrs. French. If you talk of a colloquial line,
That's
it's
right.
so simple.
Oh, yeah. That's great.
But within it, he is saying, it's my answer to this crisis, to the big crisis of identity, is to look right down the street. It's just in the very simplicity of beyond that ridge, as if he's pointing. It's the familiarity.
Good.
The sense of community,
the locale,
and this is where he turns first. The sensibility turns first.
He's trying to He's trying to summarize his life too in its landscape, I suppose. And he's built this tower, and he hasn't built it. He has bought it. It was built in the 12th century or the 13th century. But he is trying to establish some solidity of presence that will counteract the decay and process which he feels in the first beat of the poem. And it's interesting to look at, because you could hear from what Michael was saying and from what he was reading, Mrs. French belongs to the Anglo-Irish.
Double F French?
It would have been double F, but there is another kind. There is a double F French too, but in this case it wasn't. But she was 18th century Anglo-Irish. Next stanza is The Peasant. Raftery was a poet writing in Irish who wrote about a woman called Mary Hines, and Mary Hines is a peasant. So you have Yeats, the two cultural icons for Yeats are the Anglo-Irish and the peasantry, each of which he thought could be established as the ground for the new culture. Of course, he's missing a little bit, namely the Catholic middle class, for one thing, which he doesn't kind of include, but it's a very Yeatsian thing to establish as his nest the Anglo-Irish on one hand and the peasants on the other, the poor Irish. All of them in this place in East Galway, where it is east of the west of Ireland. That's the song, and there's him talking about poetry again, isn't it? She was made one. She is Mary Hines was the kind of Helen of Irish poetry, of Gaelic. Raftery was a peasant poet. He was a singer, he was a blind man, and he wandered around, and he was Lady Gregory collected. But she was the Helen of Troy of Irish peasant poetry, and you can see she's driven men to die, right? They go off into the bog and they drown, as he did. And what he's also referring to is his Celtic Twilight book from the 1890s, I guess, which does with that, Hanrahan and so on. So those are his cultural reference, I suppose. Yeah. Yeah, and there's also a joyous. These are joyous associations and comic tales of and the magic, filled with the magical power of historical and personal memory. But when you talk, it is there's a sort of a hierarchy of Mrs. French, and that he found very, very appealing, and a certain balance of the common and the more refined. And that's what he hoped for. Reconcile the two zones of Irish culture, to reconcile it. Samuel.
Well, there's hardly an image of reconciliation when the butler comes.
Exactly. A peasant's ear.
Yes.
You love that. No, well, don't use reconciliation, use cohabitation. These conditions exist.
Well, and
And for Yeats, the contradiction is perfectly easy.
and if they generate tales that are told down through the years, then they've accomplished a great deal, because his major concern of the poem is the fading of identity, and the fading of people, and the fading of memory. So if these tall tales and these meanderings or wanderings, you call them, result in some exaggerations, at least it gives him a sense, or it gives the entire community a sense of identity and a sense of
in a certain
memory.
way, too, Yeats was indifferent to exactitude, and what he wanted was things making a certain kind of sense. The Butler cutting the ear off, I love the line, "gifted with so fine an ear," which is, again, Yeats being unlikely Yeats, being funny. But the movement between Anglo-Irish, Normans, who founded it, Anglo-Irish, the peasant landscape around, the peasant cultural landscape or human landscape around, and then that old man, the bankrupt. It's a funny presence, kind of like a ghost of decay and degeneration, which he also includes. So the whole poem is a
You're
kind
talking
of,
about the bankrupt?
yeah, the bankrupt master of the house.
I think that's so important.
Yeah.
That's near the end of the question. You've skipped ahead a few stanzas.
Right.
But I think there's not a neighbor left to say where he finished his long day, an ancient bankrupt. I think that's the fear of what might happen. Not the fear, but it's a tone that runs throughout the poem of this fading, away of identity, this ruin.
I agree.
And that people can be harried and talked about 1 minute, and then several decades later forgotten about entirely.
I think that's right.
And it's that
the poem kind of, in saying things like "enough, I must recall, oh, towards I've forgotten what," is itself an image of decay, of dwindling, you know. But it's lovely, for me anyway, the way what Yeats achieves as a modernist here is to include the negative in the process of making this very powerful, architecturally composed piece out of bits and scraps, almost. That seems to me to be a modernist possibility that he has achieved in his own terms. I mean, Yeats and modernism are a vexed kind of question, but that would be part of it. And then we get on to the questions. What are the questions, basically? Yeah, yourself, you had a...
Doesn't he, he fears, well, maybe I should no longer be this great poet and become wise like Plato.
Yeah, right.
And yet, he's still this great poet.
And he's making stories.
And not only that, he feels like he's a great poet, and whether I have the wisdom that, say, Plato or they have, no, this is who I am. And I am the poet.
Yeah, well, I am the poet.
At
the end, he kind of ends up in Zen land after a fashion, doesn't he? He moves east from Plato and Plotinus. Yeah. But you're right. I mean, the assertion. Let's go from those actual questions. Did all old men and women, rich and poor, who trod upon these rocks or passed this door, whether in public or in secret rage, as I do now, against old age? That's the question.
But I have found an answer.
That's right. What is the answer, do you think? Yeah,
the answer is yes.
The answer must be yes.
You know.
Right. And you say, okay, the answer is yes.
Right. That's
Let's
a simple
move on.
one, yeah.
Because that was a simple question.
Right.
But then he moves...
And what a profound answer it is. I mean, if you think he's summoned up every neighbor and every precious memory, and he says, did they all go through it too? Did they rage also?
That's right.
And then he says, yes, obviously they did. And
there's no double entendre here. It's just old age, well, is bad. To use not to use a colloquialism, which we would say.
And maybe there's a Yeatsian humility here too, in the sense that, as even the great poet, he's telling us that he's certainly not escaping it, you know.
So here's old age. Yes, bad news. He gets the answer.
Right.
He gets the answer and he doesn't even bother telling us.
Right.
I have got my answer, he says.
Right.
But I have found an answer in those eyes that are impatient to be gone. They're gone. The ghosts go. Yeats is a great summoner of ghosts.
Yeah.
And this is a poem about ghost summoning, clearly, too. And then he dismisses them. But leave the one I created.
Oh, God. Now, it's like things aren't bad enough. Old age isn't bad enough. Raging against it. but there's something else that goes on all the time anyways.
Yeah.
It's an enduring mystery of love's uncertainty, the travails, the questions, opportunities missed. You know, we've seen them introduced in the earlier poems. They continue throughout life.
And
they make it rather a humiliating...
Up to a point, and he's angry, he's bitter, and he's still, he's a randy, bitter old man, too, as he becomes. Old lecher with a love on every wind, he says about Hanrahan. And he starts to talk about himself here, too. Because I always thought that the next stanza was, admit you turned aside. Suddenly I thought,
oh,
he's talking to
no.
himself.
Sure.
So it's
Sure.
a curious... The poem is full of swerves. Swerves of subject, swerves of addressee. He's talking to Hanrahan. Old lecher with a love on every wind. But then he says, does the imagination dwell the most? If on the lost, admit you turned aside. Who? Hanrahan?
Definitely.
Yeats created... No, Yeats.
And what is he saying of himself? He's saying that it wasn't just fate, or it wasn't a woman did something to him.
Yeah.
It was something within him brought this loss about himself.
It's
and
probably the most humiliating thing he says about himself.
Yes.
Did you turn away...
And the most solipsistic.
Yeah.
The most genuine, I mean, not genuinely solipsistic, but it universalizes a solipsistic question that many of us ask ourselves many times. Yeah.
Did you turn aside from the great labyrinth out of pride? And he talks about the labyrinth of another's being. It's an extraordinary image, isn't it?
But he uses...
The labyrinth of another's being. That's what love is, presumably.
But this is, of course, not... He doesn't repeat the word accidentally, because the labyrinth in Hanrahan, the labyrinth is the delight of another's being, the pleasure of being lured towards another.
Yeah.
He turns away from a great labyrinth. That's a dark, and that's a disappointment, and it's a different usage of the word, and emphasizes the difference.
That's right. Were you afraid? Were you too proud? Some silly oversight thought. I mean, Yeats is a great one for self-flagellation. You know, and that's probably what enhances his greatness for us, is the degree to which he is so honest about himself. He is so unsparingly, and yet he can do it and not lose status or stature in our eyes, because he does it in this manner, which is itself a form of oratorical public display. And there's drama in Yeats all the time. He is always, in a certain sense, on stage, even at his most private, as here, and under eclipse and the day blotted out.
Now that's
you get that kind of ringing or operatic kind of conclusion.
And coming at this stage of life for him, this is a pretty despondent kind of state of awareness.
And then the swerve again, right?
The next part 3, the nest building, he tries to fight back.
Yeah. Well, he does it very powerfully. I declare, I proclaim, I declare, I make my will, I make my soul. I mean, when you consider the verb forms in the last part, you're in the presence of somebody of extraordinary willpower. He's making his will. That's a pun too, presumably. Yeah. It's his will making, as well as making a will. And then he, in the end, says, not only will I make a will, I'll make my soul. And do you remember Keats, who talks about the veil of soul making, you know, and that's what man has to go through, that's what a human being has to go through in order to become human. You have to go, he talks about, it's not a veil of tears, it's a veil of soul making. That's where we live. And Yeats is making a soul here. Others have said it's a phrase in Irish, I don't know. But I think the Keatsian reference is certainly there. When he makes the soul the way the bird makes a nest, out of all that stuff.
But then at the end, something else begins to happen. He really, I think, begins to offer a solution. Yeah. And it's a very interesting one. I'll begin by characterizing it that from really where he begins to talk of the daw's chatter, there seems to be a beginning of a distancing. The ending is so powerful, but it's as if he's saying, as if he's as if he's letting go,
Yeah.
and as if his solution seems to be a kind of, not indifference, but a kind of a detachment.
Surrender, I suppose, of a kind. It's very, I mean, psychological, it's very Zen, it seems to me. That's what that last moment is a kind of Eastern quietude, almost, in that last image. Wouldn't you hear that? You know, the bird's sleepy cry among the deepening shades.
But that follows right on the heels of that incredibly warm, incredibly felt thing that the worst, you know, he's dealt with his own crisis and predicament, but then he says there's even worse evil will come.
Oh, yeah.
And this is just the warmth of the man, you know, the death of friends or death of every brilliant eye that made a catch in the breath.
Yeah.
That's the most tragic note. That's the most unbearably tragic note in the poem.
Yeah.
But he pulls back at the end to almost a new perspective, almost seeing it all, the need to see it all, the need to deal with it all in a not to embrace Plato,
No.
but to see it, put it into a perspective of history maybe, or to detach himself from it in some way.
Attachment. I shall make my soul, compelling it to study in a learned school until the wreck of body. I will study. Okay, I'll study, but the study is on his terms. He is embracing what he rejected at the start, or what he was afraid of at the start. He's embracing that. That's what seems to me to be happening here. He's embracing that, but on his own terms. And those terms are to transform the kind of abstraction of Plato and Plotinus into this kind of surrender to what is. There's that moment at the end, the bird's sleepy cry is almost Basho. You know, it's almost like just a normal, ordinary fact being acknowledged and letting it be. Yeah, you had a sense.
Necessity of acceptance.
I think that's absolutely there. Yeah,
But
I think that's very
it's
much
like
there.
the opposite, you know, all of the nest building that he does, everything he brings to him throughout the poem, everything he summons up to give himself strength, purpose with this crisis. At the very end, he realizes it's to see it from a distance. It's to realize that it's almost a fiction.
Yeah,
you know?
seem but the clouds of a sky.
Yeah, it's almost a fiction, and that in reality is what it is.
Sure.
Well, not quite a fiction, but in reality, it's of such minor, in you know, in a certain perspective, as all of our lives.
I think what's lovely too about Yeats is a poem isn't summed up in its end. A poem isn't its ending. A poem is the whole of the thing. And what we have gone through, you don't read poems, you experience them. And what you go through here in the experience of this poem, the happening of this poem, is an extraordinary account of a consciousness coming to terms with age and process and decay and all of those things. And it's so inclusive rather than exclusive. So we could spend another hour, and we won't. But
let me read.
Yeah, go ahead.
How about if I read Dialogue of Self and Soul, Part 2?
That's Part 2, right?
And then we're definitely going to leave time. Last time, Eamon rushed his own poems, and we won't have that. We do want question and answer.
Right. Sure.
Why don't we just read these next two with a few little notes?
Right.
Then you're going to read your poems,
Yeah, right.
and then we're going to have questions. And I'm sorry, it's just
Yeah,
we
right.
felt.
Why don't we have
poetry-
questions? I'll end with a couple of poems. But
However,
anyway.
okay.
So the second part of Self and Soul is, and just listen to this, those of you who are here, of as a kind of how far it is removed from the end of the last poem. The last poem we've just read is the end of quiet acceptance, surrender, the necessity of acceptance, as somebody said. This one isn't going to be like that. It's a different kind of thing. It's a much more, if the last is kind of surrender, this is much more coming to grips with.
But again, I would just stress too that his interest, his psychological insights, and his awareness of the development of different stages of development is really a very remarkable thing. This is Part 2. And there's just one short poem after this, so bear with us. Myself. A living man is blind and drinks his drop. What matter if the ditches are impure? What matter if I live at all once more? endure that toil of growing up, the ignominy of boyhood, the distress of boyhood changing into man, the unfinished man in his pain brought face to face with his own clumsiness, the finished man among his enemies. How in the name of heaven can he escape that defiling and disfigured shape, the mirror of malicious eyes cast upon his eyes, until at last he thinks that shape must be his shape? And what's the good of an escape if honor find him in a wintry blast? I am content to live it all again and yet again, if it be life to pitch into the frog spawn of a blind man's ditch, a blind man battering blind men, or into that most fecund ditch of all, the folly that man does or must suffer if he woos a proud woman not kindred of his soul. I am content to follow to its source every event in action or in thought, measure the lot, forgive myself the lot. When such as I cast out remorse, so great a sweetness flows into the breast. We must laugh and we must sing. We are blessed by everything. Everything we look upon is blessed.
It's an amazing movement, isn't it? From the quietude of the last poem to this absolute need to embrace, to be content, to take everything. Everything, to take it, not to let it be, but to actually take it. The words "I am content" are repeated, and it's an extraordinary affirmation. I guess that's the point. It is such complex affirmatives that Yeats ends in, and this poem is in The Winding Stair, another poem, so it's the next book.
But
it's a very different tone, isn't it?
He looks so honestly at life. He's saying, really, he begins by saying life is essentially, if we drop pretense, if we drop idealization and so forth, life is essentially a humiliating experience, a blind man battering blind men. But yet, look at this joyous ending that he finds space for. And again, almost sort of out of our control. They're two different states, and they both coexist, and we can drift in one, and then if we're lucky. I'd also point out that the end has a sort of forgiveness or a catharsis of oneself.
Oh, geez, that doesn't adjust.
It reminds me of the language of benediction. Did you see that? Yeah. He uses, the poem is a heavily religious poem, and it's a dialogue. But it reminds me of, it's not by accident that he's blessed or everything he looks upon is blessed or casting out of remorse. It's in keeping with the religious diction and situation of the poem, and it's really, I think, brilliant. And I just hastily point out one thing. Go ahead. It also it reminds me of kind of those rare moments of getting off the analyst's couch when it's been one of those rare successful sessions, because it really captures sort of the capacity to forgive oneself for the humiliating guilt trip that life often is, and to see oneself in a fresh light, or actually to forgive oneself, to bless oneself. And I know nothing. It's a deeply psychological poem.
Psychological, and I mean, it's also when such as I cast out remorse. When somebody like me cast out remorse, he said, because remorse was one of the days. What does he say at another point? The day's folly, the night's remorse. I mean, it's a famous line in some other poem. Yeats was given to remorse. It's odd because Joyce, Stephen Dedalus talks about agenbite of inwit, which is remorse of conscience, right? And of course, when Yeats says, I cast out remorse, he's acting in an entirely un-Christian way, because remorse is one of the ways you get forgiven, right? So it's a wonderful un-Christian moment.
That's right.
And Yeats is, of course, a non-Christian. He's a pagan of his own kind. But we must laugh. I love the fact that it's another autobiography, encapsulated in bad stuff, you know? The ignominy of boyhood, oh dear. The distress of boyhood changing into man, oh my. You know, I mean, Yeats, he just
But it's there
pinpoints.
it is again. You don't stand a chance if it's not what they.
That's
So
right.
even if you master all the parts, you're going to see yourself the way you're in. Or even if you can overcome the ill will of enemies, then honor can find you in a wintry blast,
Oh,
which
they're
means
terrifying.
life can.
That's right.
What's the expression?
Don't even use it. Again,
Yeah.
I think it's bad. Right.
So.
No, I do think what I love too is the way in The Tower he writes one kind of autobiography, a cultural autobiography in the second part, and in this it's a very personal autobiography, his life, his boyhood, his ignominy, all that stuff, and a touch of, but again, notice, it's not particular. It's kind of general, the ignominy of boyhood. Yeah, well, I've had it, you've had it, we've all had it. It's a generalization once again. But Yeats manages to invest his generalizations with such personal passion that they feel they are ours, but they are also his. First of all his, and then they can go on to being ours. Again, I would say this poem, in both of its parts, but in the second part in particular, is an example of what the later Yeats is, poem as thinking through. The poem isn't the finished product of thought. The poem is the enactment of the thinking through of something. And that's what makes them great to me. We are in the presence of process. And process is what they're about, as well as how they are about. I mean, how they become to be. So it's that feeling when he says, when such as I cast out remorse, the whole sense of standing at a very different point. Everything we look upon is blessed. Everything we must bless, we must sing, everything. Notice it's we.
Yeah.
You know, such as I, we, that he dissolves the self, which has been so aching throughout that poem, into a communal feeling. And we must bless.
Well, he writes out of, among many other things, out of just tremendous courage. Tremendous courage, and to state what many people think or experience, but might not have the, you know,
the courage, or the language to say.
Right.
Again, it's kind of something to do with language being capable of being adequate to an occasion of extraordinary complexity, and to follow to its source. That's what he's done, basically. And then the last poem is Politics, which we'll just read. Will I just read it? Where is it? Because this was the poem Yeats... It's okay to read.
Yeah.
This is the poem Yeats wanted to put at the last... The poem he chose as the last poem. But when the editors got around to it in last poems, they put Ben Bulben at the end because it ends with his epitaph.
Yeah.
You know, and very nice. Close the book.
Yeah.
You know, get him underground. But it's very interesting because just the day after he died, a big chunk of that poem appeared in the Irish Times. Irish poets, learn your trade. And from the voice of the grave, you hear Yeats telling the younger poets to get on with it, you know, but in my way. And of course, they didn't do that.
Well, this is the perfect...
This is like a little coda, which he wanted to put at the very last poem, as a sort of little stamp. And it goes back to all the stuff we've just been saying about aging, because it says, even so. You know, I would be content to live it all. That's what he's saying in that last poem.
Cast a cold eye on life, on death. It's don't take it all too seriously.
That's right.
And
plus, don't cast a cold eye, want. You know, the last image is one of desire.
Yeah,
really.
yeah.
Politics. So, and this is around, this is 39, he's writing, this is 38, I think. So you can imagine what Europe is like in 38, right? Russia and Germany, etc. America too. In our time, the destiny of man presents the meaning in political terms from man. How can I, that girl standing there, my attention fix on Roman or on Russian or on Spanish politics? Yet here's a travelled man that knows what he talks about. And there's a politician that has read and thought, and maybe what they say is true of war and war's alarms. But oh, that I were young again and held her in my arms. I mean, here's a man voyeur looking out at the woman at the bus stop, basically. I mean, to think of Yeats ending on that note is to see his stature is so human.
And he's a Nobel Prize winner at this stage, long before, and to take himself so unseriously in a way.
And the little piece I gave you on that beside the French poem, it was an earlier thing. It just shows you how Yeats revised. You know, beside the window stands a girl I cannot fix her mind. It's a much lesser thing. and he revised towards music and speech and organized expression. That's enough of that.
Well, you've been fantastically. I mean, you saw questions, please. And, you know,
if there are
thank you for your patience.
let them fall upon not deaf ears. Yes.
What amazes me is his freedom.
Right.
That he can use. We are blessed by everything. Everything we look upon is blessed. And then I am content to live again. I am content to follow. In other words, he can say anything, and it's right.
Yeah. I think there's always that sense of power in Yeats.
Sense of power, the ability to put it there, and it's right.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, but he gets there through drafts. If you look at his work, he revised and revised, and he was asked, "Why do you do revising so much?" And he says, "It is myself that I remake." You know, and there's a great story of him and A.E. They living at houses on the same street in Dublin, walking by, and A.E. says to him, "What sort of a day do you have, Willie?" And Willie says, "Great day, George, great day. Remember that line I was really working with, and I couldn't get right." And George says, A.E. says, "Yeah, of course I remember. It was terrifying. It was really giving you a lot of trouble. Well, spent the morning getting it right. I got it right. It was just right. And what did you do in the afternoon? I changed it back." So that was a good day's work, right?
Did you have a question? Did you have a question? No, I thought you raised your hand.
Yes.
I've always wondered about the lines in the tenor, the moon and sunlight, when an inexorable being. I try about is he playing on lunacy?
Absolutely, yeah. And dissolving two of the most potent images that we have into one is to make men mad. Plus,
or maybe avoiding making men mad by bringing some salutary sunlight.
Yeah, that's also a possibility. Isn't there? But he keeps pushing us so we can't quite figure in rational and complete rational way what's going on there. For if I triumph, I must make men mad. What's that mean exactly? Well, it presumably means you've got to escape from the rigors of the rational mind. That was his father's notion, and that was his, to kill the rational, not to kill it entirely, but that's his whole engagement with the occult and with the religious possibilities and the next life and all. They were all against 18th century rationalism of a certain kind. So I think that's part of that too.
I think there's also, isn't there the idea that, you know, if I succeed, I'll make men, you know, that through his art he may hold out certain pleasures or possibilities that when we come back from them, we can lose our minds.
Yeah, lose our minds. But it's the Dionysiac side of Yeats. He wants to be Dionysian in certain ways. Samuel, you'd
well, of course, we are not blessed by everything.
No, I mean, we know that, but Yeats didn't, and he thought everything he looked on blessed. Yeah, right.
When we forgive ourselves...
Great lies are what make great poetry.
Blessed by everything.
No, but when we bless ourselves, when we forgive ourselves, it's such a jarring experience that we feel that we are blessed by everything.
But that's your poem, Samuel. But for Yeats, we are blessed by everything. Of course it's an exaggeration, but there is a sufficient amount of truth in it that says even the worst is possible. King Lear, you know, what's King Lear about? I suppose it's been blessed by nothing in the end, but the play, of course, blesses us. There is no rational answer to that, of course.
Now, Eamon is going to read a couple of his poems, and then for more questions, anybody who has questions, we can just go on and on. But I want him to read his own work.
I'm going to read 3 wee poems. So one is a hare. So I thought I'd read a poem that's set in the landscape of Yeats, and it has a hare. It's called "Beholding the Hare." It's just a description. Yeats rarely described. This is a description. Beholding the hare. In the gale that's trying to take the roof off this small house, shaking it to its rocky foundations, the hare is making his rounds of the garden. Wet morning light shows me ears hemmed in white, their black points, how they flatten when the wind roars, rise and swivel when he hunkers under the shelter of hedges or against the drenched stones of the wall. All he knows is the way the weather is, how it wraps him in its fits and starts, a sort of swirling whirligod whose breath he must turn and turn about, huddle from, or bask in. Now he stretches to get at a dark green leftover bramble leaf, all else bare as sea-beaten stone, and showing to the wind and rain its skin and bone. Tree bark bright as those black-currant eyes that read the world like a book, each page changing the story, no matter what we, or the hair, or the one-ruffled chaffinch balancing between red and yellow pegs on the clothesline can make of it. Right now, what I'm struck by is the hair's articulate singularity, the way he's all of a piece, every particle precisely in the present moment, from the ink tip of each ear to the chalk tuft under his raised tail, from the fur-coated ripple that's all muscle when he tenses a haunch to the delicate tremor his nose makes as it fetches the rest of the world into the realm of his understanding, that many-scented evanescence in the wind of things, what his eye can't find, nor his tongue touch, nor the soft fingers of his fur make sense of, nor his quick ears swivelling to every whisper, but which the snub, brown shiver button of his nose finds, filling out his feeling for the world, any minute of which would take me an age of translation to carry over even a glimmer, knowing no words for his wholeness, for all the stuff of sense registering at once on the shell of him, how he's the kernel of its kinetic wheeling by just being there, free of memory and forecast, being at one with possibility like that, and not at odds, not split in the middle and out of focus, not feeling the very ground nerved and veined with tremor cordis, fault lines branching every which way from the lost centre, the heart itself out of tune, unable to contain itself, not, that is, one of us, soul-searching in our skin of reason. So that's that one. And here's one with Yeats. Sorry. Okay. So I'll end with this one. It's because it has Yeats in it. It's the only poem of mine that has Yeats in it. But Yeats has a number of wild things. We've read some of them already. But among other things, he says, a poet writes always of his personal life in his finest work out of its tragedies, whatever it be, remorse, lost love, or mere loneliness. He never speaks directly as to someone at the breakfast table. There's always a phantasmagoria. He is never the bundle of accidents and incoherence that sits down to breakfast. He has been reborn as an idea, something intended, complete. That's very like the stuff we've just heard, that intended and complete thing. But I always thought, given what Yeats says there, that it'd be great to think, what a sight Yeats must have been at breakfast. He mentions, I thought I'd write a poem about Yeats at breakfast, but I didn't actually get him to breakfast, but I got him into the kitchen, which he probably didn't do much of. So this is called In the Kitchen with Yeats, and it came out, I mean, it was written just when I'd gotten a new collected edition of his poems, and I was trying to learn The Wild Swans at Cool off by heart. Okay, so that comes into it too. It's a couple of lines. So now we know that. Say. Did you learn it by heart? I did, of course. Yeah, right. I don't know if I can say it. I won't try to say it, obviously. But so here we go. And it's about, for me, being influenced. Harold Bloom talks about the anxiety of influence, but really influence is food. You know, we eat our ancestors, and I think there's a part of that gets in here. In the Kitchen with Yeats. Since the poet is never the man who sits down to breakfast, never that bundle of fragments, but the composed whole bloke, buzzing iambics behind a closed door, I suppose he wasn't one to linger if ever he visited the kitchen, his sense of smell confined to incense, honey, wine, and other emblematic fragrances. So what would he make of me in this cottage kitchen on his birthday, stirring a sauce for pasta, one hand holding a wooden spoon, the other his collected poems, a fresh edition. With one ear I listen to the homely little splutter of tomatoes, spices, garlic, a diced onion, as they bubble towards their unity of being, and with the other I can hear the clear, austere music of the Wild Swans at Cool, the ache of its defeats beating through that one lost rhyme each stanza, and through those clean lifelines of his that keep cheating us out of ease but lead to grace. Wooden spoon tapping the skillet, I close my eyes to get the poem by heart, making its cold, companionable manners my own as long as that music lasts, while all the while the cottage fills to steamy brimming with smells that distill into the air some vegetarian notion of the soul, and fills with the ceremony of sound he stirred into the stock of his own marrowbone soup, to keep us, even in lean times, warm. When I close the book and leave the sauce to simmer, the whole place breathes a single compound smell of garlic, tomatoes, onions, oregano, pepper, cinnamon, wild thyme, all in a base of olive oil and crowned with a leaf or two of bay. Later, wondering how he might have relished the scent of his own ascending dinner, winding up the winding stairs, I'll spoon the wine-dark mixture over fettuccine, sprinkle parmesan aged 9 months, prop up his book against the bowl, and eat.
Great. That's terrific. Are those recent?
That one's quite old. Thanks.
Are they both? He'll be signing copies of the books.
See ya.